Hi folks, welcome to episode 4, Devotion, Death and Dissolution. In this episode, I really wanted to explore the role and legacy of the medieval church in the city and the county. But the more I explored, the more stories I uncovered. And once I'd filmed it all and put it all together, I realised I had over 40 minutes of footage. So rather than edit out a lot of interesting things, I've decided to split the episode into roughly 2 equal parts. In this first part, I'm going to focus on the medieval religious orders in the town and county. And in the second part, we'll look at the secular church and the role it played in everyday life before exploring some of the town's lost parish churches and what the archaeology of those sites tell us about life in medieval Leicester. We'll then uncover the seeds of Reformation and discover the legacy of dissolution on the town. For now, sit back and enjoy part 1. Cheers. In the medieval era, life was dominated by 2 all-encompassing obligations: service to the crown and service to God. Your service to the crown depended upon your social status. As a peasant, you worked for your lord; as a lord, you gave service to a nobleman; and as a nobleman, you gave fealty to the king. And it was the king who governed the kingdom, ensuring the rule of law was upheld via the courts and that peace in the land was maintained by the armies he could muster from his nobles and knights. You were born into a class of people, and generally you stayed in that class for your entire life. Working hard did not change your status, and so your clothing, food, marriage options, home, etc. were all determined for you, often before you were even born. However, service to God, and by default the Catholic Church, was universal. All classes and ranks of people, from royalty to nobles, from nobles to peasants, all paid homage to and were affected by the rulings of the Church. The Church governed every spiritual aspect of daily life, from baptism and confirmation in childhood, to marriage ceremonies and confessions, to anointing the sick, and ultimately administering the last rites to the dying and burial. As well as this day-to-day involvement in people's lives, the Church also governed the yearly calendar of religious observances, festivals and saints' days, each with their own corresponding rituals and practices. Finally, and most importantly for some, the Church held the key to life, a better life after death. In a world of punishing labour, bodies would get injured and broken. With barely even a basic understanding of infection, the slightest cut or abscess could soon lead to sepsis and death. And at a time when medicine was focused on balancing the 4 bodily humours of black bile, yellow bile, blood and phlegm, plague and pestilence would regularly ravage towns and villages. And then, of course, there was the very real risk to life presented by childbirth. Death was a very real part of everyday life, regardless of your wealth or social status. Key to coping with much of the trauma and anguish wrought by a perpetual presence of death and loss was simple yet steadfast faith. Faith in God, faith in the Church, and faith in the knowledge that if you lived a good life and did not sin, you would be welcomed into the kingdom of heaven, where you would once again be reunited with all those you had lost. But what did this life of faith and devotion look like for the people of medieval Leicester? Join me, Jim Butler, as we explore the sometimes checkered history of Leicester's churches, friaries and abbey, from their foundation to the dissolution, and how the town's people from all classes prepared for death throughout their long or sometimes tragically short lives. Welcome to Hidden Histories of Leicester. After the Battle of Hastings in 1066, William the Conqueror organised his kingdom into a social hierarchy known as a feudal system. At the top was the king, followed by his noble lords, and at the bottom were the peasants and serfs, who worked the land and provided the food and taxes that maintained the system. But we'll explore Leicester's medieval social hierarchy properly in a future episode. Instead, let's take some time to familiarise ourselves with the medieval Roman Catholic Church, which had a hierarchy all of its own. At the very top was the Pope, who is God's representative on earth. Beneath the Pope are his cardinals, who represent the Pope in their home countries and regions. From here, the Church splits into 2 distinct groups, the regular Church and the secular church. The regular church consisted of men and women who have decided to devote their lives to God. Like the monks here at Mount St Bernard's Abbey, just outside Colville, they all swore vows of obedience, celibacy and poverty. Most of these people lived in communities governed by a rule, which is a book of instructions. The most influential and widespread rule was the rule of St Benedict, which set out a detailed routine consisting of manual labour, prayer and study. Although this monastery is less than 200 years old, it is the rule of St Benedict that the Trappist monks here still follow today. There were numerous other religious orders in the Middle Ages, some stricter and others more lenient, which can be categorised as monastic orders, mendicant orders or military orders. Monks and nuns try to remove themselves as much as possible from the secular world, ideally living in communities with minimal contact with the outside world. And prior to the dissolution, there were over 30 of these religious houses across the town and county. So let's look at some in a little more detail. Follow me. Founded in 1138 by Robert le Bossu, the second Earl of Leicester, the Abbey of St Mary de Pratis, which means St Mary of the Meadow, grew to become one of the wealthiest religious houses in the country. Upon foundation, the Abbey assumed control of all of the churches within the town walls, along with their possessions, including the College of Canons at St Mary de Castro. It was also gifted numerous churches in Leicestershire, Berkshire and Northamptonshire. The founder's son, the third Earl of Leicester, Robert Blanchemains, donated a further 720 acres of land at Anstey, whilst his devout wife, Petronilla, financed the construction of the Abbey's great choir. In fact, it was even said that one of the lamps in the choir was suspended from the ceiling by a long cord made from her plaited hair. Shortly after, in 1148, Pope Eugene III granted the Abbey an exemption on paying the tithe on all newly acquired land and livestock, on the condition that there was to be no impropriety or violence when electing an abbot, and that those who donated money to the Abbey could be buried within it even if they'd been excommunicated. The Abbey prospered until the latter half of the 14th century, the decline probably related to the impact of the Black Death. The Abbey continued to decline in the 15th century, with the abbot, William Saddington, being accused of pocketing various minor revenues, not disclosing the Abbey's accounts and keeping servants. He was even accused of practicing magic, including divination. Perhaps he was able to see the future because, despite the corruption, he made the Abbey financially stable, and so the bishop appears not to have been too harsh with him when taking measures against his indiscretions. However, in the 16th century, things were to get worse, with the arrival of Abbot Richard Pescal. Like Saddington, he was accused of financial improprieties, but his other extravagances were to get him into more trouble. He was said to have an excessive number of hounds that roamed freely, fouling the church, chapter house and cloister. He rarely attended church services, and when he did, he would bring his jester, who disturbed the services with his buffoonery. His bad example also rubbed off onto his canons, who ate and drank at improper times, failed to attend services, and roamed freely outside the Abbey, visiting the town's alehouses and frequently going hunting. Despite all of this, the bishop was unable to get rid of Pescal because he kept sending gifts and bribes to Thomas Cromwell, the king's right-hand man. After 10 years, Pescal finally resigned with a pension of £100 a year. But despite his successor's valiant efforts to pay off the debts accrued to the Abbey by Pescal, the writing was already on the wall, and the Abbey was finally surrendered to the Crown for dissolution in 1538. We'll discuss the dissolution a little later, but for now, let's head to Bowbridge. As well as the Abbey, medieval Leicester was home to 3 other religious orders. These orders rejected the monastic model of living in a single isolated community or working at a trade and owning property, land and wealth. Instead, these orders, known as mendicants, actively avoided owning any property or working at a trade to generate any income, and instead embraced a poor lifestyle devoid of sensual pleasures for the purpose of pursuing a more spiritual goals and rewards. They would often travel from place to place preaching to the public in an attempt to bring the religious ideals of monastic life into a more urban setting. In 1254, an Augustinian friary was set up here on a small island between the two arms of the River Soar, with Westbridge to the east and Bowbridge to the west, most likely on land gifted to them by the 6th Earl of Leicester, Simon de Montfort. There were never many friars here, perhaps 20 at the most, but over the centuries they benefited from a number of gifts of money from notable people of the time, as well as bequests in people's wills, mostly from residents of the town, but some as far away as Warwickshire, Nottinghamshire and Lincolnshire. The friars also received income for prayers to be said for departed worshippers. The location of the friary just outside the town walls was also very convenient for at least 2 escaped criminals who sought refuge in the friary church as it was outside the jurisdiction of the town. Excavations of the site in the late 70s uncovered the graves of 28 individuals. 9 were children and adolescents aged between 8 and 18. Of the 19 adults aged from about 21, only 1 was female. Most of these adults were in their early 30s when they died, and the eldest 3 were no older than 45 years old. Signs of a lifetime of hard physical labour were visible on many. Now let's head across the river. In the northwest corner of the walled town lay the site of the Dominican Friary. The Dominicans arrived in Leicester in the mid-13th century, and they followed the mendicant rule of St. Dominic. The Dominicans occupied the former St. Clement's Church, which was sited beneath the current All Saints Road, and which probably was quite run down by the time they arrived. Their distinctive black robes differentiated them from the other holy orders in the town, and so they became known as the Black Friars, and this area of the city is still referred to as Blackfriars today. Little is known of the Dominicans' work in the town, and many of the findings from the recent waterside redevelopment excavations on the site of the former friary are still being analysed and studied. However, the burials uncovered during those excavations do paint quite a vivid picture of a tragic event in the town's history. Overall, 454 burials were discovered on the site, consisting of 297 adults, 126 children and adolescents, and 31 babies and young children. What was most shocking though was that more than half of those burials, some 256 people, had been interred in mass graves, signalling that they had died during a pretty catastrophic event. The bodies had been laying one on top of the other in layers with up to 23 bodies in a single grave. Understandably, the archaeologists' initial thought was that they had discovered a grave from the Black Death of 1349. However, radiocarbon dating disproved this when analysis showed that the burials occurred sometime in the 10th or 11th centuries. Although no single event of this scale is known of, the burials could be evidence of a large-scale famine like the one mentioned in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle for 1087. When, through the badness of the weather, so great a famine came all over England that many hundreds of men died a miserable death through hunger. The presence of these mass graves may also explain why the site and the area was largely abandoned and run down prior to the Dominican arrival. We look forward to hearing more from the findings of the archaeological analysis. For now, let's head to a more famous spot. The last of Leicester's Mendicant orders was based just within the town's southern wall, between Friar Lane and St Francis's Lane, which is now called Peacock Lane. The Friars belonged to the order of the Friars Minor and were known as Franciscans, named after their founder, St Francis of Assisi. They wore a distinctive habit of grey cloth and a belt of rope which had 3 knots in it to symbolise their 3 vows of poverty, chastity and obedience, and they were commonly known as the Grey Friars. The Franciscan Friary was the first to be founded in the town, sometime between 1224 to 31. Although it's not clear who founded the friary, its location next to St Martin's, which was the wealthiest parish in the town at the time, does suggest it had the support of the affluent. And a number of the floor tiles from the site, bearing the coat of arms of the Earls of Cornwall, suggest a strong link with the Plantagenets. This is most likely through Henry III's sister, Eleanor, the Countess of Leicester and Simon de Montfort's wife. In 2013, archaeologists discovered a rare lead coffin containing the remains of a woman. The Lady in Lead, as she's become known, was clearly an important person, as her coffin had been placed inside a stone sarcophagus which was then buried in front of the high altar of the Friary Church. It's possible that she was an early benefactor of the Friary, and one theory as to why she was first placed in a lead coffin, which is uncommon for the era, is that she died away from Leicester and needed to be transported some distance to be interred at the Friary. The Friary became notorious in 1402, when several of the friars became involved with a conspiracy supporting the deposed King Richard II over the current king, Henry IV. 2 of the accused friars escaped, but the rest were arrested and sent for trial in London. Despite being acquitted by 2 juries, at their 3rd trial, they were all convicted and executed. By this point, the 2 escapees had also been captured in Lichfield, and they were also executed. Such was the sensitivity of the issue that, at a regional meeting of English Franciscans held that same year in Leicester, it was explicitly forbidden for any member of the order to speak against the king. Speaking of kings, there is of course one more former resident of Greyfriars site that we have to mention. After his defeat at Bosworth, Richard III's battered and naked body was paraded back into Leicester, where it went on public display, possibly at the Church of St Mary of the Annunciation in the Newark. After a few days, his body was removed, probably because it was starting to smell by that point, and it was brought here to the Greyfriars. Why Richard's body was brought to the Greyfriars we cannot be sure. It may be that the Abbey was seen as too prestigious a site for him, but that the town's churches were not secure enough. Or it could be because the friaries were often seen as neutral venues for the burial of executed traitors, especially those of high standing. Whatever the reasoning, despite his rank, Richard was placed in a hastily dug hole in the choir of the church, which turned out to be too short for his body. Perhaps showing some remorse for his vanquished foe, 10 years later, King Henry VII paid the not inconsiderable sum of £50 for a tomb of many-coloured marble to be built on the site. At the Dissolution, the Franciscan Friary was extremely poor, with an annual income of only £1 and 4 shillings, compared to Leicester Abbey, whose income was £786, 16 shillings and 1 3/4 pence. Despite there being monuments to Richard's gravesite well into the 19th century, it became common folklore that the last Plantagenet king's remains had been dug up and cast into the River Soar at Bowbridge after the Dissolution. However, in the 1920s, historian C.J. Bilson regarded this as improbable, and in 1986 this view was further endorsed by local historian David Baldwin, who suggested a possible location in the vicinity of the now infamous car park. It was this research that Philippa Langley of the Richard III Society cited in her efforts to get the site excavated by the University of Leicester's Archaeological Services. The rest, as they say, is history. Of the original 13th century friary buildings, only one segment of wall still remains, fittingly in a car park just off New Street. Okay, let's head to the county. The final branch of the regular church in medieval Europe were the military orders. These were set up to both wage war in the Crusades to reclaim Jerusalem from the Muslim rule, and also to protect Christians travelling on pilgrimage. Perhaps the most well-known of these orders is the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, more commonly known as the Knights Templar. They were founded in 1139 and originally headquartered on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. But as their power and influence spread across Europe, local and regional headquarters called preceptories soon appeared in England. In 1231, the Knights founded a temple here at Rothley, of which the chapel still survives, here as part of Rothley Court Hotel. Once established, King Henry III granted them the entire manor and church of the village. The preceptory would come to own land in 13 neighbouring villages, and in 1284 was also granted a charter to hold a weekly Monday market in Rothley, as well as an annual fair in honour of St Barnabas every June. Unfortunately, in 1291, the Templars lost land in Jerusalem, and as such lost purpose, power and influence. King Philip IV of France, who was heavily indebted to the Templars, had his puppet Pope, Clement V, issue an order to arrest the Templars for various offences. Legend suggests that this occurred on a Friday the 13th, hence the date being considered unlucky for some. Subsequently, in 1308, Rothley Preceptory, together with the Templars' other possessions in England, were seized by the Crown. In 1313, the Preceptory and its lands were transferred to another military order. So let's head to Beaumont Leys. This site, here at Castle Hill on the edge of Beaumont Leys, once belonged to the Military Order of Knights of the Hospital of St John of Jerusalem, commonly known as the Knights Hospitaller, who, as well as providing care for the sick, poor and injured pilgrims headed for Jerusalem, were also charged by the Pope with care and defence of the Holy Land. Around 1240, the Hospitallers acquired the Manor of Beaumont from the current Earl of Leicester, Simon de Montfort. Here a substantial settlement was built, consisting of a main hall and chambers for pilgrims and guests. Barns and buildings for the keeping of livestock, fields for farming and a large fish pond were also on the site. In 1338, the site came under the Hospitaller Preceptory at Old Dolby, who had also taken over the Templars' site at Rothley. In 1482, the Hospitallers exchanged the Beaumont site with Edward IV, and he incorporated the site into a royal deer park. But these religious orders of the regular church only form the minority of the institution of the Roman Catholic Church. The largest portion was made up by the secular church, which is the arm that the vast majority of the medieval population of Europe engaged with. So to explore this further, let's head into Leicester. I hope you've enjoyed part 1 of Devotion, Death and Dissolution. This seemed the logical point to split the episode, so I'll give you a few days to absorb all that information and then I'll release part 2 next week. To make sure you're notified as soon as the film becomes available, be sure to subscribe to the channel and then also press the bell icon to get push notifications, and that will let you know as soon as the video is ready. You can also follow us on Twitter for the latest information and sneak peeks at upcoming episodes. In the meantime, stay safe and I'll see you real soon.